Welcome, everyone, to the first substantive session of the day. This panel, we have a framing page on this panel that's in the YAPA and on the website if you want to read more about the background and motivation. But NNIP partners have always reached out and collaborated with allies to change things for better in their neighborhoods and improve opportunities for residents. But there's always been a little bit of a hesitation of our neutral data provider being independent and engaging with advocacy groups. And recently, we've heard from all of you about either pressures that you feel internally to engage closer with advocates to make the change in your communities, or from funders who want you to be closer to the people who are moving policies and programs in new ways. There was a great camp session in Los Angeles that many of you attended that this panel really drew out of, and there's a link to that on the website too. But I think the benefits of working more closely with advocates, we can learn about emerging issues closer to the ground. I think Durham will help share about that piece. We can learn how to effectively present our information. So we don't need a 100-page report. They need a 2-pager, or what pieces of, which indicators, as Jeff mentioned yesterday, like which indicators are they looking for that are really going to either convince the city council or point the way to the right evidence-based solution. But there are risks. So you could be seen as partisan. People could stop believing your data and analysis that come out of your shop that say, oh, well, they're just trying to present a point of view, and we're not convinced by the work that's coming out. And I think there is a real danger of crossing or having conflict, increasing conflict with government agencies. If you're critiquing the mayor's affordable housing policy or police brutality, that these government agencies that we collaborate with, that are data providers, that are really a part of our network, and working with advocates who are critiquing those groups can also pose challenges for our partners. So researchers are in a similar position at the Urban Institute, and we have heard exactly from funders that we need to be closer to advocates on the ground to make change, like around the public charge issue, for example, and from us who want to make more policy change and want to put that data in the hands of the right people nationally. So some colleagues have been thinking about how we at the Urban Institute set formal and transparent principles to working with advocates, parallel to our funding principles, which I shared a link with too in the meeting session. So really setting the terms ahead of time, really thinking organizationally about what this means, what's a good partnership, what's not a good fit. And some of the draft principles are, I'll go over a couple of them, I think really would resonate with all of you too. So one is to ensure independence from advocacy partners. So we reach our own conclusions and have final editorial control. We won't suppress findings if it happens to be against the advocacy point. Maintaining the rigor of our products. So perhaps there's sometimes where we'll have a research report and then the advocacy group publishes another interpretation or recommendations or policy based on that. Protecting our brand. In general, we don't co-brand events or products. Thinking about advancing public understanding. Is the advocacy partnership important to the field? Do we think that's necessary? And then finally, being transparent about funders and partners. So just making it really clear up front about who is involved and how as we do our work. So there's, and as these evolve, they're draft internal now, and as these evolve, I'll definitely share them with you. So, but there are, as we were talking about it on the phone, on the panel, different kinds of advocacy and different kinds of advocacy organizations. So we're lucky today, as usual with NNIP, to pull in 3 different perspectives from different homes and different political contexts with slightly different missions. So each city is going to give an opening 5-minute overview of sort of their approach and thinking or issues, and then we'll have some panel discussions before we open it up to all of you. So I'm hoping the PowerPoints are all here. We also didn't talk about an order. I think, Seema, do you want to go first?
Yay. Good morning, everybody. I think this is going to be both left brain, right brain kind of panel today, because it is about passion as well as kind of the data analysis that we do on a regular basis. So I'm going to walk you through a little story of how we've arrived at where we are, or maybe me even personally has arrived where I am, because we're a pretty old NNIP partner, right? We've joined in 1999, I think. I don't know what the official date is. Maybe somebody needs to look that up. But either 2000, 1999, it was ancient history. And we were one of the first ones to be a part of this network. And our signature product is the Vital Signs Report. We've issued that every year since then. And one of the things that became pretty evident is that if people have started to use the information, and I will say up until 2015, that was where we left it, right? We put out this compendium of data, we showed a couple of kind of interesting patterns that we were seeing, and left it at that. And we didn't really have too many real policy recommendations as a way to stay away from kind of advocacy. But so this is the very first report that we put out back in 2001 around vacant and abandoned housing in the city of Baltimore. Anybody? I know some of, obviously we had a meeting in Baltimore, but if anybody's never been to Baltimore, okay, excellent. Not too many of you, we welcome you to come, but. So the vacant and abandoned housing map, the darker the color, the more vacancy there is, and this is an official code violation by our housing department saying that the housing stock is uninhabitable. Back in 2001, it ranges, which unfortunately you can't really see, from 0 in the very light colors up to 22% in the very dark colors. Clearly a sign of disparity, right, in our city, and notice how close some of these disparate neighborhoods are. Literally from one neighborhood to another, you could go from a perfectly decent neighborhood to one that has 22% vacant and abandoned housing. So this is kind of an eye-opener back in 2001 when we officially put this out. And this is the map from 2015, so 14 years later, pretty much the same map. And unfortunately, it's only gotten worse. Now the range is from 0 to 35%. So the question is, what were we doing for 14 years that we couldn't move the needle on such a critical indicator? And it obviously came to a head in 2015. This is the location of the University of Baltimore, which is where the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance were housed. And this is the site. Literally, we could have walked to the site where Freddie Gray in Baltimore had been picked up, and kind of a lot of unrest ensued, civil unrest in the city of Baltimore. For all of us that have been in cities that saw this kind of unrest, St. Louis, Cleveland, New York, this was actually personally debilitating for me. Not only the proximity of where this is happening, literally right outside my door, but we had all this data, right, showing and pointing precisely in the neighborhood with the highest level of vacant and abandoned housing is where this kind of unrest ensued, right? Not a surprise, right, from a data point of view. So the question is, what had we been doing for the last 15 years that we clearly are not doing something right? Because our mission is to help neighborhoods that are in this kind of distress, and clearly we weren't doing enough. And that's really kind of what drove me to start rethinking what the value is of the data that we're putting out, what the purpose of the work that we're doing, and really kind of an existential moment, quite frankly. So I even went on, sabbatical, actually, to take a moment to figure out who actually makes decisions in our cities, because it wasn't clear. We had a mayor at the time who decided not to run for re-election, so we literally were in a leadership vacuum in 2015, leading into 2016, and we're trying to figure out if the data that we were putting out in the Vital Signs Report wasn't going anywhere, what do we do now? For those of you that were in Los Angeles, it was one of the foundations that said, you know, it's okay to put your data out there and let the chips fall where they may, or do you have a point of view about your data? And it was very clear now after the uprising in Baltimore that we had a point of view. We needed to be very clear about what that point of view was, and we needed to put it out there for everybody to actually have access to. So, not to get too theoretical, but I did a lot of reading about urban governance. How do decisions get made in our cities? Because it's not terribly clear, even if we come from a strong mayor city like mine, or kind of a strong legislative city like you might be. So I actually did a lot of reading around urban governance, which if you have the chance to do that in your life, I recommend it, because our data has to go somewhere, right? It has to go into the decision-making process, and if we don't understand what that is, that's a hard nut to crack. So this is work by Ed Patrice. He's from this University of South Africa, Cape Town. If you haven't read most of his work, I recommend it. And he's saying, look, it's not that there's one person or one entity that has power in urban areas. It's that there's these 5 domains of power, and over time, they're basically constantly competing with each other to assume power. So it's called the relational urban governance of power. And at any moment, one of these domains could assume power and get something done. And that's how cities work. And if you think about your own city, you can see that sometimes one of these 5 domains will rise up as being kind of the thing that makes the power in your in your city. So it's basically representative politics, which is where we all spend a lot of time with our elected officials. We spend a lot of time there. I spend a lot of time with grassroots and community development organizations and neighborhood associations. You know, we go into neighborhoods all the time. We spend a lot of time with foundations and task forces and kind of the legitimized groups that build consensus around decisions. I think more and more we're dealing a lot with the media, but maybe not all of us are dealing, but he mentions that the media is such a critical part of our discourse. And then finally, the advocates. The advocates are a clear part of how we want to make things happen in our cities. So that's what we started to figure out, that we have a point of view, we have to get it beyond just the 3 places and get it into the hands of communities. So in 2015, we had a pretty clear objective to make sure that we address the fact that we have very limited affordable housing and work with our advocates to make sure that we can let people know that we have a point of view. We started putting out op-eds, which we hadn't really done before. And we started actually working with the advocates a little bit behind the scenes. They had coalesced in a new way in Baltimore to try and put on the ballot that we would have an affordable housing trust fund. And we started working and providing them with very clear data on how they could make the case and what they should put in the actual referendum. And then I wanted to make sure that it's very clear that what BINA is advocating for, BINA is what we call it in Baltimore, Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, and what I personally am willing to put out and do, like I went advocating and like door knocking to get people to vote yes for question J, which was the referendum. And when I did that with my personal hat on and not my university hat. And luckily, we did pass an affordable housing bill at the time, and hopefully this is something that we can kind of continue to do when it fits within our point of view. So clear message is that the reason to engage with advocates is because they're a critical part of the decision-making process in urban areas, and we have to pay attention to that.
Morning. So we at Dataworks are a 501c3 community data intermediary in Durham, North Carolina. And our main priority is serving local neighborhoods, community organizers, and local government, but we prioritize empowering people who have historically been excluded from the processes of power in Durham City and County. And one of our main products and projects is the Durham Neighborhood Compass, which is a public-facing interactive mapping tool for sub-county publicly available data elements as well as administrative data. And we're working on encouraging broader use of it through lunch and learn sessions. So just to give a little bit of historical context, the urban tier was the first urbanized area in Durham, and it was the original cluster of mills and factories and the workers that were housed by them. Many of them rented from the companies that were existing there. And this is the area that was most directly impacted by historical policies like redlining, highway construction, urban renewal, racial covenants, and the expansion of Duke University, and the movement of the textiles and tobacco industries to other places.
So a lot of the work that we do is the result of direct requests we get from community organizations and neighborhood associations. And how do you do it? Okay. This map is a representation of something that we did for a group. Merrick Moore is a neighborhood in Durham that is rich in history. A lot of the families have been there for generations. And so they have a very active neighborhood association. They contacted us. They have seen a lot of change in their neighborhood, which as a result has changed the traffic patterns. They have a main road that goes right through beside a school. There's very little sidewalks, and so they contacted us to give them some information about traffic counts and also comparables in other areas that had similar traffic counts. And so we provided that for them. But instead of just having them come to us, and we were invited to one of their neighborhood association meetings where they had also invited one of the city council members. So we were there to present the data, but also just to sit and witness, watch them advocate for themselves, ask the city council person questions, get answers. They even had him at the point where he said he would go and cut down a tree for him if he wanted him to. And so, so that was, the beauty was twofold for me, because I had not started with Dataworks very long before we went to that meeting. And I got to witness, their advocacy, but also it allowed me to strengthen our relationship with the group themselves.
Okay, and then, in talking about this, we thought there are sort of two ways that our work comes about. One is sort of ground up way that the Merrick Moore example shows, and then another example is that sort of questions that come about organically in our own conversations. And the Durham County Land Trust was interested in acquiring properties and having trouble doing that. And at the same time, we had an undergraduate intern who was interested in eviction, specifically in displacement. And so she investigated changes in ownership of rental properties and eviction trends in Durham. And she found that corporate ownership is increasing in Durham over the past 20 years. And evictions are more likely in corporate-owned and multifamily properties. So we hosted this event that's going to be an ongoing series of conversations that we're calling Who Owns Durham? This is a photo from one of our first events. And basically the idea was to give people a platform to come up with strategies to prevent displacement. There were members of City Council that were present at the event, this last one, and we hope to see them at future ones as well. We didn't introduce them or give them a specific platform from which to speak on the issues, but rather supported the folks who had been politically disempowered to have a voice in the conversation and allowed them the chance to interact with the City Commission members on that conversation. I think that's all we've got.
Hi, so just to introduce myself, because I think this is my first time here at NNIP. My name is C. Terrence Anderson. That's what's up. All right, there we go. I love it. This has been kind of funny because I feel like I'm kind of getting initiated into a gang of data folks, which I'm happy to join. I don't know if there's a sign or whatever it is. I'm happy to learn it. Tattoos come at the end. All right, I got a spot. So my name is C. Terrence Anderson. I'm the Director of Community-Based Research and Community Programs at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, or CURA, at the University of Minnesota. You probably know my colleague Jeff, who I think already has the tattoo. He speaks very highly about all the folks here. So I kind of want to talk more conceptually about CURA's sort of theory of change, which we kind of primarily speak through our actionable research model and our racial equity framework. So I think folks know what this map is in this room, and I'm really just using this as a placeholder to say racism and sort of disparities and discrimination exist in the city of Minneapolis. In fact, it's of the worst in the country. And so I think what we like to say is policy and law was targeted about who benefited and who was disadvantaged in history, right? This isn't a controversial thought. So I think we also can't be agnostic about who benefits from policy in society today as well. And so I think KIRA was created in 1968 during a very tumultuous time in American history, as we know. In Minneapolis, there's Plymouth Avenue in North Minneapolis. If folks are familiar with North Minneapolis, that's where black folks and other people of color tend to live, tends to be more low income, less wealth, all those sort of indicators that indicate disparity exist. Like a lot of places in the 1960s, they call it the Plymouth Right, happened, and the Board of Regents at the University of Minnesota said, we need to understand why this is happening, and we need to sort of invest our resources and leverage in ensuring that this doesn't continue to happen to go forward in the future. So I'd say that KIRA from its very conception has a bias about why we do our work. So I think what we would say is that we're here to leverage our resources and our research for the people who are most marginalized, most vulnerable, most oppressed in the Twin Cities metro as well as in the state of Minnesota as a whole. So I developed what was our racial equity framework. So I think racial equity is sort of the term du jour right today to address discrimination and inequity in our societies. I do think that equity is a word that has lost meaning or is used in a lot of different ways. I think it's sort of conflated with equality, it's conflated with civil rights law compliance, it's conflated with diversity. All these different sort of things are kind of put into a bucket and we sort of boil them all together and we get one soup that we call equity. I think each of those terms are important, but I think they have distinct meaning. And so we developed this racial equity framework, which is like, what do we mean by equity? And so we would say that there are three parts to it. There's contextualization, there's community-centeredness, and then there's a reparative solutions aspect of it. So contextualize means that whatever we're addressing in equity is rooted in the historic inequities, historic policy, historic law, that led to the current inequities today. So there's a relationship between history and today. If you kind of went back into that redlining map that I showed in the previous slide and you mapped it onto housing, household wealth, and educational attainment, you'd see that they would almost match. And I bet that's true for most of the cities that are represented here today. So we want to contextualize into, so if we're talking about housing, redlining, racial covenants, which is something that's been really uncovered in the Twin Cities over the last couple years. All sorts of policies need to be at the forefront of what we're talking about today. And so I say that KIRA does a lot of research. We have a lot of indicators that sort of point towards the contextualization. I think community-centered, we believe that the people who are impacted by those said inequities should be at the forefront of co-creating the solutions. What I would argue, in a sort of a colloquial sort of way, if I hurt you, who gets to define your process for healing and what it means for you to be healed? I think in that sort of personal relationship sort of way, we'd say the person that was hurt. So how do we operate in that sort of way that this is just as much about material change as it is about addressing historic trauma and healing for people? And I think it's first putting the powers of healing into the hands who have been harmed. And so I think we sort of operate in that sort of way that we're not the people who own this work, but we're the people who support the people who should own this work. And then third, reparative, the solutions that we find we think should be equal in impact to what caused the inequity in the first place. So in housing, in the Twin Cities, we talk about affordable housing a lot. And look, affordable housing is great. I'm not going to argue against affordable housing, but that doesn't necessarily address the historic inequity of, say, the GI Bill not being equally implemented for all populations, right? So how do we go further in what we're thinking about to sort of address the disparities that exist in the Twin Cities? So that is sort of wrapped around our research model. And so we would say that research or actionable research fits in with advocacy and organizing and policy, because that's overall what happens. That's overall how change happens. And so, I do believe, of course, in other ways of knowing, and I think a lot of times communities, without having data, can say what's going on in their communities. Like folks can tell you if there's gentrification going on in their communities, whether they have the data or not. But when it comes to speaking to policymakers, there's obviously a level of credibility that they expect. And so I think KIRA a lot of times plays the role of bringing credibility for community voices, even if it is just sort of anecdotal, and so will help us make it real. But we think it exists in a continuum of working with those advocacy and organizers, all for the hope of seeing policy change. So the research that we do, we don't want it to just exist in University of Minnesota libraries and for community to never read it, but it's almost always intended to be connected in with an advocacy and organizing together in the hopes that it leads to policy change. And then I would say, lastly, in this short presentation, hopefully we can get into this in the panel, is how I think we sit in community and how these projects are derived themselves. So, of course, here we have people with the tattoos, and we have our own questions. But I think, once again, going back to that notion of healing and how it exists in overcoming and addressing disparities, is I think we just consistently sit in community. I think at least 75% of my job is sitting at organizing tables, doing one-to-ones at every single coffee shop that the Twin Cities has to offer. There's a lot of great ones, so if you're in town, let me know. But instead of sort of parachuting as researchers in the community with our hypothesis, our thesis, working with community groups to get the data, and then jumping back out to do the analysis and write the reports and sort of speak about it in conferences, I think we do that together. So not only are we researchers, we have organizers on staff, Jeff does GIS work, but we do some grant making, but all of that is at the same table with community. So I would say that our research agenda comes from sitting with community, and what we decide on is what's important to them and where they see it as sort of the nexus of advocacy and organizing and policy change. So I think those are very high-level concepts in a very short amount of time, so happy to get more into it on the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That was perfect. And everybody was right on time, too, which I appreciate. I just have a few questions for a little bit before I open it up to the crowd, because I think everyone has their own experience and journey on this, too. So we want to hear sort of a full range of perspectives. I just want to start with Seema about how your stakeholders reacted to this shift that you had, whether it's your funders, your other partners, or institutions.
Hello? Okay, whoa. Okay. So, in our case, it was an extremely acute moment, right, where everybody clearly realized that we had a problem. You didn't have to bang anybody over the head in 2015. And so what had happened was that everybody was coming to the table with solutions. And money was flooding into Baltimore, to the Baltimore Community Foundation, to foundations where people wanted to quote unquote help. And these foundations ended up doling out this kind of series of money to quote unquote solutions. And what became pretty evident was that there was no leadership around the real things that mattered. We were giving money in ways that were a little strange. And actually it's been documented, the kind of money. It was the shovel-ready solutions would get the money, which wasn't necessarily what would actually lead to change. And so because there was no leadership, we actually put down a 9-point recommendation plan where actually affordable housing was just one aspect of that. But the advocates were ready to go with that particular recommendation. The city was not leading in that moment just because we had a mayoral kind of void. And so I don't think the city was against us doing this. And in some ways, it helped them because they couldn't do it from the inside. And so the advocates were doing it from the outside. But what was nice was that the advocates brought in a much broader group of people than I think was normal. And I think that is a new moment in Baltimore, where even within advocacy, it became a much broader stakeholder group. So we had, the legal teams, we had housing advocates, we had people like us actually providing specific data to make sure that, is this referendum getting you where you want it to actually go? And so the city has subsequently actually funded the fund after it got, voted on in 2016. In 2018, they started they put in $2 million, and then just this year, they actually have part of the recordation tax will go into the Affordable Housing Fund. And all of that is very behind the scenes kind of machinations on the back end, trying to make sure it works from an advocacy point of view. So it's been a win-win in this particular case. There's clearly examples where we're not supporting what the advocates have to say because it doesn't help Baltimore. That's our clear point of view. Does your policy help Baltimore or Baltimore residents? And if it doesn't, we're going to show you in a data-driven manner that it doesn't. And that's all and that's a universal statement. And so one of the things that I think I mentioned on the slide is that we say the same thing to everybody. I don't care what party you're in. I don't care which part of that kind of domain of governance you're in. I'm going to give you the same recommendation. And that required us to be able to do that.
Great. LaTanya or Libby, I know you guys, John Colleen, who leads their organization, came out of the city, and you work really closely with the city on the Compass. How do you have any pushback, or what's the relationship with either the city or the county or your other funders on the direction that you've chosen to go on, really rooted in community?
Okay. So
Not everyone.
I think a lot of you probably know John Killeen, and he's sort of got this magical ability to be everyone's buddy. And I think that's been really powerful for building. He's spent years building these relationships and building trust with both communities. Is it not on?
I think it's not on.
Oh, is it on now? How about now? Well, there I am. Okay. So I was just saying that John Colleen has spent years building partnerships and relationships both with community partners and the city and county elected representatives. And I think he has really mercifully shielded us from any pushback that he may have gotten from the city. I think we do receive some funding from the city, and his roots, he was a regional planner for the city before he spun out the Dataworks 501c3. But I think they have, because he spent the time building the relationships with them, they trust him to do what he does and be what we've always been.
So you had it sounds like similar to being like a foundation of trust and relationships to build off of. See, Terrence, I mean, you're housed in a university, and universities sometimes have politics involved. There been any, like, how is that work with whoever dean you're under, the president, or other parts of the university that may not be centered in racial equity?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a little bit of pomp and circumstance in the relationship. You know, you have to, sort of pay respect and invite in when, even if they haven't been a big part of the work, it's a big part making them feel themselves part of the work too. But I think that, there's an internal and external strategy. So I think how we show up in community, once again, has a very distinct politics. But I think we also have to do work internally for folks to see the impact of that work. I think ultimately what the University of Minnesota, at least, wants is that they're not wasting their dollars. And I think for such a complex problem, or a set of problems that we're sort of trying to address, they want to see, is Kira making a meaningful impact on it? But Kira's been around for 50 years, and so the relationships have been built over a long period of time. And so I think we've gotten to the place where they know what we do and know our relationships in the community. Yeah.
Can I just address that for a second? I think, I don't know, maybe for some of you, this idea of sitting in the university, which we are as well, is that we stay in our lane, right? We stay in our research lane. And what I got out of the last couple of years is that urban governance is incredibly complex and messy, and we are a part of that governance. Even as a university, we have a shared kind of common interest in what happens in our city, not just from a moral perspective, but literally from a physical perspective. We're sitting in the middle of the city. And so we have to actually get involved in the messiness of urban governance and understand how people see maybe even the same issue from different points of view. It's a lot more work, I will say. You have to be in many more rooms kind of simultaneously, because all these decisions are getting made in multiple different spheres in your city. So you have to actually broaden even where you sit, which is a lot of work and a lot of ear to the ground. But I think that looking at the university as actually a part and parcel of urban governance is a way to think about, you have to get out of your comfort lane.
Then, for all of you, have there been any times when either community groups or advocates have come to you with a point of view or lived experience, and then your data showed something different, either because of data limitations or because something was really different happening?
Not so much more limitations than anything else. We had a member of a community group come to us. They were concerned about frat party houses, and the neighborhood was getting a little apathetic about it. She wanted to, have them to be more involved. And so we were looking at, she knew the addresses of the specific houses, and we were looking at data to see police calls that were made, but it couldn't show that they were coming from the house. It was just in areas around the house, so we couldn't really tell that they were a result of the party houses or that sort of thing. So she was able to get some idea, but also could see the limitations of the work and probably had to go to the police department and get some more information about what they did. So that was a clear line that we couldn't really cross.
Yeah, but again, if you have your own point of view, when an advocacy organization might be advocating for something that doesn't help, in my case, Baltimore, I'm actually going to advocate against it. So the same groups that were working on affordable housing were also championing the Fight for 15 in Baltimore, but they couldn't get the surrounding counties to join the Fight for 15, and so it was
Can you
just...
say what that is?
Fight for 15 is the fight for minimum wage at $15. But so it was just going to be in Baltimore City that the Fight for 15 bill was going to be passed. And the question remains, is this policy going to help Baltimore? Because if we look at LEHD data, 50% of people that live in the city of Baltimore work outside of Baltimore City. So, and then we literally, in our vital signs report, we showed here's the top 3 high unemployment neighborhoods in the city of Baltimore. More than 66% of them work outside the city of Baltimore. So what is Fight for 15 in the city going to do? It's actually not going to help our highest unemployment neighborhoods, where 66% of the workers actually work outside the city. And so we were able to use a data-driven approach to say what you really want to do is make this a statewide effort. So no matter where anybody works, it's a Fight for 15. And so it did die in the city and became a statewide effort.
Great. Just a little bit about, I guess, strategies for maintaining your reputation for your work as you become more vocal in the community. And I know that Durham, you mentioned people just trust John, which isn't a totally scalable solution, although I do think if I could replicate John everywhere, I would. But I mean, I do think so there's a question of the personal relationships and trust that you have, which I think Dataworks is a fairly new organization. I don't know if you have other ideas about how to have people believe your numbers even while you're taking that point of view.
For us specifically?
And everyone.
Oh, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. I mean, relationships matter, of course. And I think there are people in the Twin Cities Metro who love us, and I think there are those who are scared of us. But I think the way I think we stay relevant is once again, I think we very clearly sort of try to align ourselves with advocates and organizers, and they're a real sense of power for Kira, I think, because oftentimes when they're doing the work, they ask for us to help with it, and we're sometimes a third-party negotiator with the city too. So because we have relationships with politicals as well. So almost very recently, we had a project around our neighborhood associations, where the neighborhood associations of the cities were really at odd, and so they're kind of like, hey, well, we both trust Kira, so Kira comes in. So at some point, it becomes about who's asking for you to be in the room, even if you're not in the room. So I think because of that constant relationship building, constantly sitting at table, doing small projects that don't amount to bigger solutions to sort of develop trust, I think become really important for long-term success or viability in the broad spectrum of policy change.
Great. I do want to make a distinction between neighborhood-based groups like your homeowner associations or your CDCs or the people that have a place-based long-term investment in a particular part of your city versus advocates. Largely because advocates around an advocacy issue, I should say, they are pushing a particular issue largely driven from the work that neighborhoods kind of outgrow. But neighborhoods are looking at their space and they're doing the daily work of engaging with their government, right? They're the ones calling 311 to fill the potholes, and they're the ones actually attending the neighborhood meetings, and they're the ones, trying to work with their council person to, do, fix frat parties, right? And then the advocates are mission oriented and swell with kind of, momentum. And these two things sometimes work together and sometimes they don't. So even in your own cities, kind of really pay attention to how these things are working or possibly not working together. And so what happened is that I think to stay credible is that you have to actually take your argument to the different perspectives and see how it resonates with them. So with the affordable housing, we actually honed our argument better with every kind of perspective that we went to and sat in rooms and argued out, like, why wouldn't you want to do this or why wouldn't you want to do that? And then it doesn't become like an organization versus organization. It becomes, people versus people actually debating and trying to come up with consensus, which is hopefully what we're all after in the end. So really getting out there and putting the, not just issuing a report, or taking the report and actually walking through what do these recommendations mean to you on the ground, and can we do even something better?
Do you guys have stuff to add?
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because I think we try and position ourselves to be primarily in service to neighborhood organizations and community groups, not advocacy groups. And so, like, our primary goal is to have the questions and concerns come from those organizations and bringing folks to the table who have historically and systematically not been part of the conversations. We aren't typically in the position where we're making policy recommendations or decisions.
Great. Now I think we can open it up to the comments or questions, or if you have experiences of your own to share in any of these questions. We'll start here.
So if we're doing our jobs, then at some point we're challenging power and we're changing who benefits, and that's going to lead to attacks. And I'd be curious to hear stories when you were actually under attack, how you navigate that.
I've been attacked. So, like I mentioned, we have a 9-point plan now, literally the outgrowth of all the research that we had done, and we synthesize that to kind of clear things that we want to see in every neighborhood. So in one of those 9-point plans, one of the things that we have recommended to the city of Baltimore is that we actually adopt the small area fair market rent instead of the fair market rent, which is at the metro level, which has caused, we literally in our maps can see concentrations of housing choice voucher utilization at exactly the price point that's the fair market median for the metro. Not a surprise. People are going exactly where the price point is for that metro, and we're advocating, which is an Obama-era rule, to actually go to the small area fair market rent, but Baltimore has chosen not to adopt that yet. And actually, if you look at the Carson administration also is advocating for the smartest, so it's actually quote unquote bipartisan. So HUD was issuing, they had requested comment on it in January of 2018, and there was nobody else in the city that was going to issue this comment. But we were with the advocates the year before, and we said, look, we have to actually say this in writing to HUD that we want Baltimore to do this. And so we took that leadership role and issued the comment. They all signed off on it, but we were the ones that kind of actually put our name out there. And the new, our new public housing authority head, she was from New York and was brand new to Baltimore. and literally called me and said, why are you the one that I now have to like basically argue against? And she did an excellent job of actually bringing us together in a roundtable conversation. We sat for 2 hours with her and her staff, and we came with the data. We still haven't moved forward with smaller area fair market rent, but I think that they have at least, they know that this is why we're advocating for it. I think we see from the inside what it would truly mean for them to change the way they operate as a housing authority. And how can we actually work together to make this work on both ends? Like, how can we make it work internally to the organization? How can we make it work for neighborhoods? So we've at least started a relationship, but it started off with, you know, the phone calls saying, who are you and why are you like bothering me?
You've not been in any fights.
Oh,
Oh, no fights.
maybe you've just started. So.
Well, so Kira has been in a lot of fights, I'd say the least. You know, what came to my mind was a couple years ago, there was a manufactured home park north of the Twin Cities called Lowry Grove, that a developer, basically the owner of the land for the manufactured home park was going to sell it to a private developer who was going to raise all the manufactured homes and build these more expensive apartments on top. And so it was a very big situation. And so we have organizers on staff at Kira, and we also did sort of a research support for the manufactured home park residents. And so we very clearly chose we need to support this group and what's going on in here. And so of course, the city that the manufactured home park was in was very much on side of like, let's raise these manufactured homes, as is the case around the country. A lot of cities aren't fans of manufactured home parks. And so we were in direct opposition between the person who owned the land, the developer, and the city all at the same time. And that was, I mean, people were subpoenaed, there was all sorts of things that happened as a fight. But at the end of the day, getting into really important conversations and really important fights like that, I think is part of Kira's work. And I think we just sort of understand that. And, so we make sure that our emails are good and we're not acting illegally or anything like that. But I'm happy at the end of the day that we chose the side of the manufactured home park residents. And even though the park ended up being raised, so in a sense we lost, that's the work, right? Being on the side of those folks, I think, is where we should be in these conversations. So you kind of just have to accept it if you get into those, if you want to get into the fights. It's kind of part of the territory.
I just want to add, I mean, the thing that we have at kind of in our kind of bailiwick, right, or in our quiver, right, is that we have the data, right? And so before I go into any of these meetings, I really look at the data to see if I can make a clear data-driven argument, not to like dissuade anybody, but to really say, well, here's what the data is showing. How is what we're going to do going to change that, or how is it going to impact this? If it's not going to impact, why are we doing it? And the act of writing the vital signs report, I don't know how many people put out kind of an annual compendium or semi-annual compendium of data, but the act of writing it actually is a way for me to kind of arm myself. Like, I have the data memorized by looking and copy editing their report to be like, why does this neighborhood look so different from the other neighborhood, and what does that mean, and is this true? And so having kind of really good data behind you is really the key that sets us apart, right, from being either in the community or in a government, and make sure that you do that well, because if we don't do that well, then we really can't kind of claim fame to that, right?
I think there's another question here.
For the universities, what % of your time do you actually spend out in the community doing this outreach?
If you look at my calendar for the next couple weeks, that's probably 75% of what I'm doing. Yeah, it's a big part. I mean, because I think forging relationships. So when people, I think there's been a phrase, partnership moves at the speed of trust. I think is maybe something that you've heard before. And so I think I operate knowing that. So there are times where our data doesn't show what people want it to show. So how do you continue a relationship when sometimes it very is a very traumatic experience for some of the groups that we're working with about some very serious issues, and if we don't come to their aid in the exact way that they want them to, how do we continue to have a relationship? And so we spent a lot of time making sure people know who we are. I think sometimes owning the debt of the institution as the University of Minnesota. So the University of Minnesota has not always been a good actor around racial justice in the Twin Cities. A lot of the community very much recognizes that, and even if I was not the person who did that, when they see somebody coming from the University of Minnesota, they're going to sort of assign that blame to me. So how do we move beyond that space to get to a productive space where we're sort of co-creating work together? Takes a lot of time and energy, and so we spend a lot of time doing that. Yeah.
Is your position new at Kira? Is that a new? No, it's been around. Are your positions new?
My position's new.
Specifically around engagement? Right. What I was going to mention is that actually one of the things that we did after 2016 is that we hired an engagement fellow. She actually happens to be a state delegate too. Woohoo! So that's a nice kind of marriage there. But we knew that we had to be much more intentional. It's actually not the quantity, right? It's the quality and the intentionality with which you engage, which we hadn't really done much of. And so we specifically hired somebody to focus on being much more intentional around engagement and created a position around engagement. So maybe that's a reflection
And
of how
Latanya,
you've
you
been
want to
on.
add? I don't know, you don't know what the before is, but you can talk about your own
Right.
experience.
Well, my experience is that my position is also new, and not also, but you're not new. But most of the work that I do is to do outreach for communities, and specifically community groups, organizations, neighborhood associations. I deepen some relationships that we already have and form new ones, and so it takes a lot of time, a lot of phone calls, a lot of meetings, but it's all worth it.
And I'll just answer on behalf of the network, is that there are many of our center-based organizations, our university-based partners that have really good grassroots partners on the ground, so may not have the same model where they have the engagement based in the center, but have close ties with those folks who are doing the door knocking and conversation. So it depends on the position of the university and the staffing and all of those pieces. I think that you will find some of our partners who aren't directly connecting with the engagement that way as much. Okay, Jana and then Milena.
I can also yell real loud.
No.
Is it on?
Yes.
Okay. So a lot of you use language about, this is what we do, or this is, kind of our, like our charge, but have any of you codified some of the, maybe too loud, codified some of the advocacy into your mission statements, and if so, how, and how does that show up?
So you just question like being advocates ourselves? You're saying? You're asking?
I think your mission statement might have included advocacy to begin with.
Yes, I think Kira's does. I probably should know that for sure, but I'm pretty sure that it does. Part of it, we have two organizers on staff who are kind of ruffling feathers in community at time. So I think not only is it, Catherine seems to know that it is part of our mission statement, I think it's part of how we assign work at Kira as well. And so I would say that community engagement and advocacy, taking sort of an advocate sort of position, I would say is part of Kira's research model. So that kind of goes back to our actionable research model. So I think it's part of our processes. So I say in that way, yes, it has been codified and resourced to do well at Kira.
It's a great question, which is why I'm staring at you. But because it's a tough question to answer. So we did not change our mission statement. Our mission statement, I think, is actually pretty good, and our tagline is, I think, pretty universal and timely and timeless. Maybe it's.
Can you say what the tagline is?
It's measuring progress towards a better quality of life in every neighborhood, and that makes it a universal statement for every community, and it changes over time for every community. What quality of life, how you want to track that, and how you want to measure that. But what we did do is we went through a strategic planning process where it became clear that we needed to have this kind of a role of a more intentional engagement. So it didn't necessarily change our mission or our taglines or anything like that, but it changed our strategic direction. So.
Elena?
Hi. Whoa. I have two questions. One is, we know that when we present data, a lot of our data is census-based. Not only that, but most of the time. And in certain areas, the data is not really covering the whole story. So I'm wondering how you address when people that knows data and look at your data report or whatever, ask about the limitation of your data, how that is presented. So that's question one. And two, most of the time we try to present objective data as much as we can. But we all know that there are subjective data on the ground. And so when you engage the community, and I'm working for a planning department, so we do a lot of neighborhood plan, a lot of subjective voice. And so you try to present objective data, but sometimes it does not reflect. Did you ever also collect data during that kind of session that can overlay the objective one and put the subjective and tell the whole story of a specific area?
So like combining the quantitative and the qualitative, combining the numbers with the community voice to tell the story? Oh.
Right. How do you tell a broader
How you
story?
can
Yeah, exactly.
I'm making an example. We put together an active living index, so we're objective assessing a built environment if it's conducive to active living or not. But then you talk to people and say, oh, this is a very high score, but I'm not going to walk here.
Right.
This is the subjective component, why you have something that shows that should, and why the behavior tells you something else.
So for us, the census data is actually a very small part of our overall set of data. It's probably less than 20% of what we produce. 80% is actual local, very hyper-local data. And we do that specifically because national data sets give you the kind of, census and other national, but the local data, we're the only ones that you're going to get it from. So we really actually specialize in that. But then also, if the data looks bad, right? If I put out that vacant and abandoned housing measure, that's coming directly from our city housing department. And if a community says that's either too high or too low, we actually send them back to the data source, which is the housing department. And who's the housing department? That's their own government, right? And so they can actually get better data through a more collaborative process. So we've had experience where a community said, we have way more than 4% vacant and abandoned property, and that's what you guys are reporting. And we went back and we're like, that's how much the city gave us. They went back with the city, they went out in the community and actually did code enforcement violations. And the next year it went up to 7%. Because they actually went and made sure that the government had better data that we could start to report. And so I think that's a sign of making sure that you go back to the source whenever possible, because that's how you get your communities to actually kind of work together. But your second part of that question is, look, I'm actually probably the only person in the city of Baltimore that actually reads everybody else's report that comes out, right? Like if Hopkins put out some paper and it has something to do with that point of view, I'm going to actually use the data from their report. Or if a nonprofit puts out data that either corroborates or supports or works against what I was saying, I'm going to try and synthesize that for people. And that, I think, is something that we all actually have to do. The synthesis of everybody, or you can't literally read everything, but really trying to understand what other people are also saying about the same topic and coming up with a way to synthesize all that, not only for yourself, but for the people that you're trying to work with, because it's hard. Synthesizing all this information is the hard part, and hopefully that's what we can actually help do. Not only put out what we do, but actually put it together in the story. So what happened in Baltimore is we're putting out all this quantitative data, and the Johns Hopkins University had done some qualitative research. They had interviewed 50 youth who lived in the neighborhood where the rioting had occurred, and they came up with a really nice report. Lots of different things in it that, the city is really setting these kids up to fail. That was kind of what the report came out. But one of the key lines in there is that none of the 50 children that they were youth that they interviewed wanted to live in the city of Baltimore when they grew up. And just that one statement, like, what are we doing as a city if our own youth don't want to live here? So if we don't actually improve the quality of life of Baltimore itself, why are we doing this work? So it becomes like an existential question. So I would recommend looking at what other people are doing in your city and how can you kind of you don't have to do all the work yourself, but you can bring it in as you need it when you need to talk about it.
And Libby and Latanya, maybe you could talk a little, do you know about the health indicators process you went through, combining the qualitative and quantitative data? I don't know if you guys were involved.
Yeah, I can.
Or in broad
I
brushes.
can speak to that a little bit. Tim Stallman was sort of the main developer on that, but I think like sort of more broadly, I guess, I don't think that any data is really objective, and so like often stuff that comes from the census, which we use a lot, or industry is treated as though it's objective because it's like most frequently cited. But I think probably what is like a stronger way to present that stuff and the way that we've been trying to do it is just being transparent about what our perspective is and what our sources are. And so, and I think that's sort of the way we've tried to equitably like showcase data from the different sources we have. And so the health indicators site through our neighborhood compass is basically a neighborhood profile that shows access to health care, walkability scores, rates of different chronic diseases, and where those benchmarks are relative to the county, relative to the city average. And then do you maybe want to talk about the blog posts that are coming out of the Who Owns Durham?
Oh, okay. I sort of feel like we kind of co-create data together. So we have a series that Libby talked about. We have, it's called Who Owns Durham, where we talked about corporate ownership of multifamily properties. And so as a result, not necessarily as a result, but in conjunction with it, there was a student who did research on the properties, just in general, and how they relate to eviction rates. And then we've started doing some research on particular companies that have bought in Durham and finding out their wide ranges of, where they're funded, just the properties, the LLCs that they go under to buy different properties. And so it's sort of, we've developed these different pods of research that have come as a result of just one conversation about corporate ownership.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I sort of wanted to, excuse me, I didn't mean to. I think there's sort of 2 points that I kind of want to make. I think the first one's sort of a strong statement, but I think it's true, is that I think that narrative sometimes shapes policy more than data does. And then two, there you go. Well, that's a really important. It's a really important conversation to have, and I'll sort of say why. And then the second point is that maybe or maybe not there's objective data, but I think there is no objective questions. And I think those two statements sort of tied together are really important in your question. So, for an example, I think how we shape up what the problem is really shapes up what we think the solutions are going to be. So say for an example, on one hand, we all talk about and probably have measures in our areas about racially concentrated areas of poverty, right? And those are almost always mapped. Kira did some, Dr. Getz and Tony Damiano and Rashad Hakeem recently did a study on racially concentrated areas of affluence. And we mapped that actually around the country. So if you haven't seen that, I'd really look that up. But I think it's an interesting study because which one's the problem? Racially concentrated areas of poverty with 50% people of color or more, or concentrated areas of white wealth? Like, which one is the issue in this country, right? And one narrative is really winning in our conversation, so we really, that sort of shapes up policies of wanting to move black and brown people out into the suburbs so that they can get access to opportunity and all sort of things. Okay, I think that people should have the opportunity to live elsewhere, but why do we not also have that same conversation about concentrated areas of affluence, right? And I think historically looking up what shapes both of those things, I think there's sort of an ethical question that we have to ask, and a sort of a philosophical question that we have to ask about what do we really think is the problem in American society. And so I think in that way, like it may be an objective fact that there is concentrated areas of poverty that are dominated by black and brown people, but it's subjective to make that is the absolute problem that we need to address. And so that's sort of how I would answer the question. I think that sort of exists not just in housing or in education. I think it kind of
Criminal
spans
justice.
criminal justice.
Environment.
We really sort of need to reframe what is the problem that we really need to be addressing here. And then I think that should shape what our research questions and the data indicators that we need to be putting out there.
Other questions? Allison and Camille? Where's Camille? Allison's in the center. Allison, would you raise your hand? Go ahead, Camille.
I was just wondering, I think, Terrence, you kind of touched on it about narrative setting policies, but I was just wondering if folks could talk about kind of the, I don't know if it, I know like after 2016 was, you know, a wake-up call for some people and not for others, but kind of this existential crisis of like, oh, facts don't matter. So like,
Close down at an IP, we're done. No.
so, like, what do you do when you're in a situation where there are, you know, quote-unquote objective facts, and there's also a narrative that's, like, just a narrative, or, like, just imaginary, or, I don't know, somebody saying clean coal over and over until it exists, right? So, what do you all do when you're in that sort of situation where there's like a narrative that does not really make sense, but it's compelling in some ways, like emotionally compelling, or kind of speaks to some like anxiety or something that people have, and then on the other hand you have these, you know, facts that might be thinking that they're objective and maybe not objective, or kind of qualitative measures of folks like actual like lived experiences.
Existential problems it's a heavy conversation for Thursday morning, but yes, yeah. You might have stumped
I
everyone.
love this question. This is an amazing question. You know, so I think the first thing is that, so I don't believe you can change anything that you don't have a relationship with. And so I think part of the 2016 problem is a lack of real relationships between people with different experiences. I don't think that's the solution, but I think that's part of the thing that we sort of need to have a conversation. So a lot of groups have been doing this sort of like urban-rural exchange or different sort of research work. But I do think that work is really important. The second point, I think, is that I think we have to really know what people's underlying motivations in a conversation is. I think preservation is a real preservation of privilege. I think is a really significant sort of trend. Maybe it's not a trend; it's a historical dynamic in America. And you know, I don't think a lot of the times I'm actually trying to convince people of my argument. I think a lot of the times what I'm trying to get people to see that they're making sometimes a subconscious choice about where they're choosing to stand on a particular issues. That's to say that I don't think people are actually thinking as deeply about a lot of the issues as the people in this room are. I think I find that institutional racism is or all these different sort of things that deny facts. I think there's a lot of reasons that people deny facts. I think most people working in government aren't asking the question, is this what we should be doing? It's more likely that they're saying, well, this is the way things are done. And so I think sometimes my role is not necessarily get them to the point to convince them of my argument, but to get them to say like, hey, this is the choice that you're making, and these are the outcomes of your choices. Is that what you intended to happen? Right? Or maybe sometimes it's like, well, I didn't know that was the legacy of policy, or that this is where it came from. Now I do. What do I think about that issue now? And so I think that's sort of where data isn't necessarily, is sometimes a tool to do that, and is sometimes the answer to some of those questions. But I think sometimes we just need to sort of think about it from a human existential question about how are people actually considering their worldview and what is constructing it, then ultimately what are they trying to preserve in a conversation by taking any particular position. And sometimes people, I mean, I do believe that there are racist folks in society. There are these sort of people who don't want to vaccinate their children. There are these sort of people who don't believe in climate change, even when confronted with the facts. And I don't know what to do with those folks, so if anybody does, please come up on stage. But I don't think that that's most people's experience with data and facts, as I think there usually is sort of an underlying motivation that hasn't been confronted. I don't know, that's the best I got.
Great. Allison, do you want to ask your question? And then Charlotte Ann has a question.
This isn't quite a question, so I didn't know if a comment.
Or a comment,
Is that
or your
right?
experience? Yes.
Yeah, an
perfect.
experience, yeah. So in New Orleans, we've had a few experiences with being attacked. You mentioned that. And of course, we've always used the principles that you outlined in the beginning about, publishing our sources and giving all the data and being very transparent and all that. And so then we've had some other tactics we've used which have been helpful. We never change our data if we get attacked. And so we even had a situation where we had a small contract and they didn't like the results of the analysis. And so we said, well, you don't have to pay us and we're going to publish it anyway. And that garnered us a great amount of respect, obviously, from that particular entity. And we continue to work with them over time. So that was good. We also had the experience once where the mayor really wanted us to change some data. Actually, George will remember this. And he was, very forceful about that. And we weren't going to change the data just because the mayor didn't like it. And, so we stood by that, of course. And then also we wrote a very reasoned, academic, intellectually intimidating memo about why we wanted to change the data. And then more recently, this kind of took us by surprise. We were publishing a report for the Tricentennial of New Orleans. If you're going to reflect on 300 years in New Orleans, in a majority African-American city, you got to talk about 150 years of slavery and 100 years of Jim Crow, and then how are we doing in the last 50 years, right? So as it turns out, we're not doing all that great in the last 50 years by a lot of different metrics that we published. And one thing in this enormous report was about the size of the tourism industry and the wages it paid, and that it mostly hires people of color. And it turned out that right then, the new mayor and the tourism industry were in a fight over getting control of more hotel tax dollars. And so some of the leaders in the tourism industry, one in particular who's very aggressive, just came after us, just started saying we were socialist, we were no longer neutral, complained to board members, complained to funders. We actually lost a funder because of it. So that's been more difficult. And so far what we've done, because this is ongoing, is we continue to have lots of meetings. We're very, very patient with any funder, any board member, a lot of time talking to people, explaining. And one thing that we noticed too is, obviously people have vested interests, and that's why they're fighting about this. But one thing we know, and we say this in public, is that, according to the research, of course, boosters, have the job of boosting, and therefore they're not in the job of presenting accurate data. And so they should do their job. And of course, if they say tourism has 80,000 jobs in New Orleans, they're doing their job. And our job is neutral data, and tourism has 15,000 jobs. And then just so that we're not making them look bad, they're doing their job. And they don't actually have accurate data, and that's normal.
Other questions? Oh, Charlotte Ann had a question, if you can bring it to her.
I think we're hearing that we need actually resources on how to be really good debaters, because that's really what we have to do in many cases.
The next workshop, we heard that, so.
So as a journalist, we have some experience with people saying things that are not true and how trying to address the fact that that's not true, and with even the New York Times having succumbed to actually using the word liar on the front page. So it's a big thing that we struggle with, and I have some, the place that I go for some solace is an author named George Lakoff, who wrote a book called Don't Think of an Elephant, and it's about framing the conversation. The book is terrific. He's a cognitive scientist. He talks about why people believe things even when it's contrary to their own self-interest. In fact, he also has a lot of advice for journalists, including my favorite, which is make a truth sandwich out of things. So instead of starting with what he said isn't true, you start out with what is the truth, then say the thing that is not true, and then repeat the truth. So you make a truth sandwich out of things and don't start from the point of trying to knock down their argument. Anyway.
Solace for Camille's existential problems. Are there other questions to wrap up? Erica and Anthony, and then we'll need to close out.
I was wondering if any of you guys had some experience with something that we experience, which is we're at a university, and there are other faculty members who are also respected, and maybe, let's say, they collaborate with the research arm of the police department, and they put out a lot of papers that say exactly what the police department wants them to say. And so I don't know if any of you guys have experiences like that, and how do you deal with another voice at your own institution who also maybe has some respect in the field, but
I think that, I mean, just to kind of maybe take that and close out the session is to think about, there is the public-facing stuff that we do, the op-eds and the reports and the things that we put out in public, but there's so much that goes on in, closed door, sometimes even on the sidewalk kind of thing that is our daily lives, even as researchers. And so, that's one example of possibly where there's kind of a public potential kind of, maybe not conflict, but contradictory statements. But what I've learned is that you actually have to go and confront that. Maybe not in the public, but actually in the back room, right? To say, like, I've gone to lunch with people and really basically hashed out some of these things over, onion soup or something, or and actually, because that's how human it has to get. Because, like I said, we are in the game of urban governance. We cannot sit outside and think that we're like floating above all the decisions that get made in our cities. We are part of that decision, and so you have to actually engage at whatever level, whether it's public, whether it's kind of over a beer, and there are decisions that actually, like, people's minds that get changed over time. These are the people that we live with, right? This isn't a fly-by-the-night kind of relationship. These are the people that we live with, and so I have changed people's minds over years. Right, that someone will come back to me now and say, you said this back in 2012, and I actually believe it now. That's awesome. I get it. That you have to actually change people's mind, and it happens over years. It's not going to happen once. It's not going to happen with one report. It's going to happen over time. And so take that as a part of we have to take that as a part of our work. And in many ways, maybe that's the advocacy that we're doing ourselves, is to actually be in the game with everybody that's involved in the decision making in our cities.
Erica, you had a question? Oh, no? Okay, no pressure. Anyone else? We have a couple more minutes. Oh.
I just had a really quick question. So we talked about like the importance of everyone having data for their specific community, but it goes beyond place also, of course, into small population groups, minorities. So I'm just wondering if you've seen any trends recently in terms of which disaggregation people are asking for around like not just race and neighborhood, but some of the other communities that we care so much about. Like what do you see as emerging in those areas as you work with neighborhoods?
I don't know if I've seen, I mean, I think, of course, by gender and sexuality, I think is something we're seeing more of in the Twin Cities. But I also want to say that I relate to this as a biracial person. I identify as Afro-Latinx. We're not very good about disaggregating multiracial people from a humanizing standpoint, and I really think that that's something that we need to figure out from a research validity standpoint about how to humanize biracial or multiracial folks and data.
We actually looked at the, really segmenting what equity really means in the city of Baltimore, and I want to thank Pittsburgh did an equity. I don't know, Bob, if you were involved in that, but I know the city of Pittsburgh did that, and then St. Louis, John, put out an equity atlas. And I think if you take a look at both of those, it's a very broad approach to how we disaggregate information in both of those cities' cases. And so we took a little bit from there to actually look at, how does, how do things actually impact places of low life expectancy, period, right? We have these neighborhoods that have very low life expectancy. How is our policies actually implemented there, regardless of, it's a kind of a different measure, I guess, of disaggregation, and then looking at different racial aspects of that. So I would look at the St. Louis and Pittsburgh to think about how we might want to think about equity in your own cities. It's a very broad approach, and we did that in Baltimore. And so we're just about to release that next month, so I'll let you know.
Great. If everyone, oh, you have one more? Yeah.
I was just going to say that the Durham County Health Department prioritized both structural racism and poverty as their two sort of main focuses for Healthy Carolina 2020. And so we've been trying to make an effort in all of our maps to disaggregate by race and gender. And then I think in our housing focused approaches, based on the work from the Who Owns Durham questions, we've been trying to disaggregate renters and homeowners a lot, and then within rental properties looking differentially at single family and multifamily units.
Great. If everyone could join me in thanking the panel. I think, this obviously brought up a lot of different topics, but if there's other camp sessions or other things that you want to continue the conversation, please suggest ideas or vote for things in the hallway. And then we have a 15-minute break before we come together for the storytelling workshop. So no more panels. This is it's going to be homework and exercises and conversation amongst the groups to better tell how we are impacting the world. So thank you very much for the morning.